Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Treat Your Cover Crop Like a Cash Crop with Dr. Andrea Basche. I'm Kelsey Virgin. I'm a Senior Program Associate with the Pasture Project at the Wall Center who is hosting this webinar today. To start us off, I'm first going to go over the logistics and how-tos for the webinar system. Then I will talk briefly about the Pasture Project and what we do. Then we will do some audience polling where some questions will appear on your screen. After that, we'll get into our presentation, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So let's talk about logistics. In terms of the webinar technology, you should see the GoToWebinar control panel on the side of your screen. It should look something like this with the presentation on your left and the control panel on your right. You can minimize and maximize by clicking the orange arrow at the top. You'll want to use your control panel during the presentation, so it's best to keep it maximized. You can also click the small triangles below to open and close different parts of the panel, such as the questions pane. You'll be in listen mode only during the presentation to minimize background noise, but please ask questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. These will be addressed after the formal presentation during the Q&A time, but if you need clarification at any point or have technical difficulties, ask at any time. There will also be a short follow-up survey that pops up just after the webinar is over. Please take a moment to complete this. It helps as we develop our future webinars. I will note that some folks calling in without access to a computer will have limited functionality. You will not be able to do polls or ask questions. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Pasture Project website in the coming week. So let's briefly talk about Pasture Project. The Pasture Project is part of the Resilient Agriculture and Ecosystems Initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. We work to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest, and specifically in a 6-state region in the upper Mississippi River Basin, although we do work with some national audiences. Some of the strategies we use to promote regenerative grazing are we develop data-backed and field-tested case for regenerative grazing, which we do through on-farm research with a number of on-the-ground partners. Another is providing resources to producers for how to plan for and change to regenerative grazing practices. We also help build an alliance of supporters for regenerative grazing so that together we can reach more folks in more places. And we support shifts in political, financial, and other systems to support regenerative grazing as a widespread practice. Please feel free to visit our website or contact us for more information about Pasture Project's work. I'll have listed our contact details at the end of the presentation. Just a quick plug for other webinars we have lined up. Right now we have one in July. You can always go to pastureproject.org/events and stay tuned for future webinars that we're lining up. Okay, so let's do some polling questions to help us get a feel for who's in the room. You're going to see a question launched on your screen in just a moment, and you should be able to click the most relevant answer to you. So the first one, what is the primary role you have currently in agriculture? And so just select one: crop producer, grazer, livestock producer, mixed crop / livestock producer, government agency, university, nonprofit staff, or other. We'll just give this a few seconds. Okay, interesting. So the majority we have here today, government agency, university, or nonprofit staff, and then tied with mixed crop, livestock producer, and other. Welcome, everyone. Okay, and the next poll question, just a moment. How many years of experience do you have with cover crops if you are a producer? And just select one. And we'll give this a few seconds as well. Okay. And majority, none. So great. And then followed by 4 to 6 years of experience. So we hope that the information presented today, I think it'll be relevant for everybody of all experiences. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Andrea Basche is Assistant Professor in Cropping Systems at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Department of Agronomy and Horticulture. Her research focus is on the agronomic benefits and trade-offs of diversified cropping systems, including perennial crops and cover crops. She also has experience researching the opportunities that improved soil health offers for managing water-related risks such as floods and droughts. In her role, she is also teaching undergraduate courses in crop management. Basche holds a BS in biology from Fordham University and an MA in applied climate science from Columbia University and a PhD in agronomy and sustainable agriculture from Iowa State University. So thank you, Andrea, for presenting today, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Kelsey and Elizabeth and the Pasture Project for this invitation to share some of my work and experience with this great audience. Again, my name is Andrea Basche, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I've been in my role for about 2.5 years in research and teaching, and have gotten involved in cover crop research in Nebraska, some of which I'm going to share with you this afternoon. I was also doing cover crop research when I was a PhD student at Iowa State. And I would just say, now that I've learned a little bit about you from the polls, just about me, I'm a big soil enthusiast. And I think a lot about farmers and communities and how we can manage rainfall variability, heavy rain events in particular. We've had a lot of rain in the last year and change, a lot of rain even just yesterday. I'm always thinking about the soil, what's a benefit that management like cover crops can provide to us. I do think cover crops have a lot to offer on the waterfront. So that's, again, just a little bit more about me now that I have learned some about you. So I wanted to start just by having us take a step back and think about how we manage a cash crop, right? So that's the title. How do we think about cover crops as cash crops? And so how do we manage cash crops? So what are the various decisions or management considerations related to producing a high yielding or high profitable crop? So this is a summary table that I show to my undergraduates. In the spring, I teach a 200 level crop management course. It's taken by a lot of students across the College of Agriculture here at UNL. It's really an introduction to field crop management for the major field crops that we grow in Nebraska. That's why you see corn, soybean, and wheat here. So these are the sorts of things we talk about in the class. So we talk about nuts and bolts of crop management. So we talk about things like planting dates, variety selection, seeding rates, fertilizer management, etc. I also have them commit to memory some of the most important determinants of high yielding management, right? So I want to just say right off the bat too, you can see, you know, where I'm located and the crops that we're thinking about. Some of you may be coming from regions where you are fortunate to have different cropping systems and different climates that give you more heat units to grow in the winter, but I'm really coming at this question about treating cover crops like cash crops and thinking about how we might optimize them for more forage production, right? So I'm coming at this from a perspective of a place where we don't typically have lots of heat units and a more optimal environment maybe for winter cover crops. But so I want to say that off the bat, but I also want to ask you all a question here too. So I would like to know, when you look at this list of different management considerations, and of course, you know, we have some producers on the call. I'd like to hear from everyone. I want to know, would you say that you think about some of those factors that I just showed when you're thinking about your cash crop, or for your, for your cover crop, excuse me, are you thinking about those factors with more detail or less detail? So we'll give that a minute. So yeah, when you think about your cover crop, do you consider some of those management factors with more or less detail? I know I'm making you choose one. You got to only pick one answer here. Okay, so this is probably what I would expect, although there's, you know, about 40% say they think about these management considerations in more detail for their cover crop. 60% said less. So that's good. And the reason I ask that is because many of these management considerations that you're looking at are so critical, right? How important is variety selection? You can see variety selection here. It's one of the most important considerations for our major field crops in terms of producing a high yield. people spend lots of time and money making these decisions about their cover crop or their cash crop. But then when you think about a cover crop, right, would you select a corn variety that was variety not stated, as we might do for, a cereal rye cover crop? What about planting? Would you broadcast seed your soybean crop? I don't think you would, right? So I just want us thinking about some of these considerations as we're going through today, that it feels like we probably are considering many of the decisions that we make with more detail for our cash crops. And so related to this today, I'm not going to talk about all of these things in the context of cover crops, but these are the elements, these top 2 planting dates and crop varieties that I want to focus on today. So we've done some work here in Nebraska considering cover crops following corn and opportunities to plant earlier with different comparative relative maturity corn hybrids, and considering some different corn planting dates that would allow earlier harvest and earlier planting of the cover crop. And of course, these are 2 really important considerations when we think about producing a high yielding cash crop as well. But these are the ones I want to focus on in the context of integrating with our cover crops. And so related to this, what resource are we really thinking about optimizing when we're considering planting dates and variety selection? We are really thinking about, I'm going to go back and show my shining sun again. This is what we're thinking about, right? We are really thinking about optimizing our growing season, right? So how do we optimize the length of time that our cash crop has to access heat and sunlight to do photosynthesis? And then how can we think about sharing some of that growing season with the cover crop? So when we're making those decisions about planting date and variety selection, we're really thinking about how do we optimize the growing season available, the sunlight available, and heat units available for our crops, right? And we know that there are a number of opportunities for extending the cover crop growing season, many of which you may have experience with as a producer or as someone who is studying or giving advice about cover crops. So there are things like interseeding or overseeding cover crops into standing corn or soybean, maybe at vegetative growth stages at this time of the year or closer to harvest. People are thinking about and experimenting with. I always get questions about planting green when I give presentations. It seems like more and more people are thinking about this, that they're planting their corn or soybean directly into a live cover crop in the spring, so it's got more time to grow, and then terminating it after. And then, of course, there's what farmers talk about as having a lot of success with too, but maybe less time with the growing season, but drilling your cover crop directly after harvest in the fall. But so really what we're talking about in this research that I'm presenting today is this last option, right? So again, I know there's a number of opportunities for extending the cover crop growing season. This third option is the one that I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to focus my presentation on some work that has been primarily conducted by Dr. Nilovna Chatterjee, who's a postdoctoral research fellow with my research team, and some work that we anticipate will be published soon. So this is work that is based on an interesting field experiment that was actually conducted before I got to the University of Nebraska. So I started just at the end of 2017, but was conducted by Roger Elmore and one of his PhD students, Angela Bastidas, in my department. And they had a really interesting field experiment where they worked with rye following corn, trying to get that rye, this is winter rye, planted earlier in the fall by using different corn planting dates as well as different comparative relative maturity corn hybrids. And so what we've done in our work is extending the findings that they've found from this field research by using a farming simulation platform. And so we wanted to try to answer 2 questions that you see here, and I'm going to talk obviously a lot more detail about that. But so these are some of the questions that we are interested in, right? So how much difference does it make when you're shifting planting dates and variety selection on your corn yield? And then how much additional cover crop growth can you get if you are planting earlier in the fall or even terminating later in the spring? So with that, I want you to think about these questions and see if you can maybe guess or what your intuition is about what might produce different yield and different biomass amounts. So I have 2 poll questions for you right now. So which of these options will usually produce a higher corn yield? You can only pick one. So would corn usually planted in April produce a higher yield, or corn usually planted in May produce a higher yield? I'm eager to hear what people think on this one. Okay, so we're about 6 and 4 again. So about 65% say corn planted in April will produce a higher yield. 35% say usually corn planted in May. Like I said, I know this is a tough question because you probably think it depends, but I'm making you guess one or the other. Okay, one more question too that's related to this. So which one of these cover crop planting and termination options would produce more cover crop biomass? If you planted the cover crop earlier in the fall and then terminated earlier in the spring, or if you planted later in the fall and terminated later in the spring. So which do you think would usually produce more cover crop biomass? Ooh, all right. We're really split on this one, 50-50. That's great. So about half of you think if you planted earlier and terminated earlier, that you'd have more biomass. And about half of you think that if you planted later and terminated later, that you'd have more biomass. So I know these were tough questions, and I appreciate your playing along, but I'm hoping that I can provide some answers for you as I share some of what we found from this research project. So let me tell you a little bit more about that now. So here in essence is what they did in the field, right? So if you imagine a longer season or full season variety, which is most typical, at least where we are in Nebraska, where you would plant your corn, let's say in May, as is represented here in this diagram, you would expect to have a crop that you could harvest by about mid-October. And you can see from this that that doesn't leave you a lot of time here to establish and then have the cover crop grow into the spring in year 2 when you might have soybean. Okay. But if you had another 10 to 15 days through growing a variety that was more medium season, 100 or 105 day variety, you could see that that could make a difference in terms of when you're able to harvest and when you're able to plant, if you're able to follow that immediately with a immediately follow the combine with the drill, which is the way that I hear farmers think about this. So you could see that that could lead to more cover crop biomass in the spring. And then even with another 10 to 20 days, if you had a shorter or early season variety, 80 to 90 day corn, then you could even get your cover crop planted by maybe mid-September, and that could lead to a lot more growth by the spring. So essentially in this field experiment, what they did over 2 years at South Central Ag Lab, which is in South Central Nebraska, they grew a rye cover crop following a range of comparative relative maturity corn hybrids. And they also looked at 3 different corn planting dates. So that's not really represented in this diagram, but they looked at planting corn in April, May, and June. So what did we do with that data? So we used the data that was collected in the field from the experiment that I've just described to test a crop simulation model. So this is the name of the tool. Its acronym is ABSIM that we work with. I actually do some work in my teaching as well as research with this platform. So it's a computer program, right? It's been developed by the equivalent of the National Science Foundation in Australia, and it's been utilized widely around the world for several decades. And it has a number of different elements, as you can see represented in this diagram here. and it has the equations that are meant to represent the processes such as crop growth and soil dynamics. And we use that field information essentially to set the model up as best we can to represent what they did in the field, and then to test the predictions that it gives us to see that it is realistically predicting corn yields and cover crop biomass. Those were the two things that we were the most interested in here. So we can give you lots of different predictions, but we were focused on corn yields and cover crop biomass. So what I'm showing you in terms of the research results is all going to be model predictions that are based on data that's been tested from that field experiment in South Central Nebraska. So it's a representation of South Central Nebraska, but in terms of the conditions and management, I think it's fairly typical of what we would see across much of the Corn Belt. Okay, so I want to start with some of the results here with corn yields. So what you're looking at are graphs of the 6 different comparative relative maturity varieties that we included in our analysis and how they yielded in the 3 different planting dates that we considered in April, May, and June. I realize that I have metric units here, and I promise I have bushels per acre later in my presentation, but really what's important, I think, to consider is just the relative differences. And so I wanted to orient you to this graph here that you're looking at corn yields for the different varieties and the different planting dates. And then I'm going to show you in the next several slides some of the main results at the top here. So what we found off the bat to answer the first question that I asked you was that generally, if corn was planted here, we said April 20th and May 13th. So it was kind of late April, 3rd week of April, and the middle of May, that we did not see any differences in yields. So that was a bit of a trick question. So what you're actually looking at is for all of these yield predictions, we ran these simulations for 30 years. And so we picked 30 years because 30 years, according to climatologists, represents a complete climate record. So this would be averaged across all of the different seasons that you might expect, right? So what we saw is that I'm just starting with the longer season varieties, we did not see any differences between, let's say, 110, 115 if it was planted in April or if it was planted in May. They basically yielded the same. So that's what we found for April and May planting, but what we found for June, as you probably would expect, that across the board for all the different varieties, there was a slightly lower yield. So again, it's basically what we would expect, but the interesting thing about a tool like this is that you can run these simulations for an extended period of time and look at averages and say, you know, even across a number of different seasons, we typically see June is when the yield decline hits from a planting date standpoint. And then next I want to highlight some of the predictions for the different planting dates and varieties. So essentially, we found that there was no difference, again, between any of the varieties if you planted them in April or May. So essentially, if you planted an 80-day variety in April or May, you got about the same, but that there were differences between the earlier season, the medium maturity varieties, and the longer maturity varieties, right? So that is basically what we would expect, that if we give the crop more time, more growing season, it produced more. So no differences between the varieties planted at different times, but differences between the varieties. So how do those yields one piece of it, right? How do they relate to harvest dates? So this is a summary table of the planting dates that we considered and the different comparative relative maturity hybrids, and when the model predicted the corn was ready to be harvested. So that is when the crop reaches, according to the simulation, 15.5% moisture content, right? So that's a neat thing about using a tool like this, is that we can see, you know, how different planting dates and varieties, what kind of harvest date might we expect, which of course would tell us when we might anticipate that we could plant our cover crop if we're going to do that immediately after. So you can see a difference here of about almost a solid month between the different varieties, and then a few weeks between the different planting dates. So that's what I wanted to share in terms of the predictions and what we found from a corn yield standpoint. I want to look at the other side of it. What hopefully most of you are most excited to learn more about is the differences that we saw in terms of how much cover crop biomass we might achieve if we're planting earlier, knowing that optimal spring planting of your cash crop is paired with the variety length so that you can open up more time in the fall. So what you're looking at in this graph is predictions of winter rye cover crop biomass values for a planting window of every day between the 15th of September and the 31st of October. And so what we did in this first scenario was to think about all these different planting dates, assuming a mid-April termination timing. So we assumed just April 15th, because we know that's kind of more conservative on the termination side. And so we're thinking about this if you wanted to optimize or have a more aggressive strategy of planting your cover crop in the fall. So again, I know that I have metric units for you here. So kilograms per hectare is not quite to 1 in pounds per acre, but it's about 10% less if you want to try to do the math in your head. And I do have a slide at the end with everything in those numbers. The other thing I want to call to your attention in this graph is that we have broken out the predictions based on differences in the seasons, right? So for this location, we grouped the climate data that we had, whether or not the growing season of the cover crop between September and April was above or below average for moisture and temperature. So you can see we created these 4 different weather outcomes, whether it was a cool and dry year, warm and dry, cool and wet, or warm and wet, right? Because we obviously know it's going to make a huge difference whether you have more heat and water. So that's what you're looking at in these first graphs here. And I want to start at the high end, right? So if you were able to plant consistently for, again, these are run for 30 years, taking the averages and then sorting them by the different weather seasons. So if we think about consistently planting a cover crop on the 15th of September and terminating it by April 15th, then you're looking at about 2,700 kilograms per hectare, about 2,500 pounds per acre on average. And if you go way to the bottom end of this, what you're looking at, if you're waiting until October 31st to plant your cover crop, on average, about 1/10 of the amount of biomass. So you're looking at less than 300 kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre. So pretty big difference there between planting 6 weeks earlier, right? And the neat thing, again, about a tool like this is that we can come up with a number like this, right? So on average, this works out to a difference of 55 pounds per acre of biomass per every day that you're able to plant earlier. And I really like this concept because it shows how much you can gain by giving the cover crop a little bit more growing season, right? So I know we have some of these conventions that we're used to thinking about. Colleagues of mine in Extension talk about, you know, for every day you plant after May 1st with soybean, you could lose 3/4 of a bushel, depending on your location, right? And I understand that we're fighting for growing season in the climate that we have, but can we think about, you know, extending that window for the cover crop? And if you're able to plant earlier in the fall, as in this window, the number that we calculated was about 55 pounds per acre more per day. So the next thing I want to show you is a similar graph, except thinking about termination timing in spring. So here, again, we thought about kind of the other side, the other scenario, that if you were planting at a more conservative or typical window in the fall for the cover crop, if you're planting by mid-October. So here we assumed a planting date of October 10th, and you had varied termination timing in April. So we simulated a window of between April 1st and April 30th. So other side of this, thinking about a more conservative planting window in fall and maybe more aggressive termination timing in spring. So let's just start at the lower end here. So you'll notice again that early versus late April makes a big difference in terms of how much cover crop biomass that you're going to get. Of course, that translates into you know, additional forage opportunity or additional benefit from the cover crop. So if we start by planting the cover crop in mid-October, terminating by the beginning of April, you might get on average over these seasons about 400 kilograms per hectare or a little less than that. But if you were to delay termination to the end of April, you could get about 1,400 kilograms or 1,300 pounds per acre. So it's almost 4 times as much if you terminated earlier versus later in the month. And so, we thought about April 30th in the context of the traditional cover crop termination and cash crop planting recommendation, which is to wait 10 to 14 days post cover crop termination. And what we also looked at in this, or what we found from this experiment, is that the mid-May corn planting was no different than April, right? So this would still, in theory, say that you could get 4 times more biomass if you were to wait until late April, and that still gives you a reasonable amount of time before you'd want to plant, before you plant your corn without seeing a potential delay or yield penalty, I should say. And then the other thing that I want to point out here is the obvious about the differences that we saw here depending on the weather. So it's big, right? We know that the weather makes a difference over the fall, winter, and spring growing season for the cover crop. So generally speaking, what you notice and what we found is that you need, at least what the model prediction is telling us, which makes sense from our intuition, at least average moisture or temperature to be able to get kind of average growth. So you can see that the warm and dry or cool and wet. So again, that gives us 1 above average moisture, 1 above average temperature. Those kind of end up in the middle, right? So they'd be kind of closer to the average. Of course, the more optimal scenario is if you have a great season that's warm and wet. But the difference between these on average between cool and dry and warm and wet is about 4 times difference, right? So I just keep that number in mind. If your neighbor says, or you're talking to someone who says, oh, cover crops won't work, if it was a bad season, then it could be 4 times better, right, in terms of the amount of biomass you get. And just a little pet peeve of mine, that when people say cover crops won't work, in fact, when I hear students do that, I tell them that that's kind of being lazy as an agronomist, right? Like I tell them that if somebody comes to you and they want to make a cover crop work, then you should help them make it work, not just say that it won't work, right? So anyway, I'm off my soapbox now, but the difference in the season can be 4 times greater, right? So we can make it work, but the season obviously has an important difference. And then I'm going to close my results slides here with the same summary of what we found for the average gain in waiting 1 day more to terminate in the spring. On average, what we found was that led to about 31 pounds per acre more of biomass per day. And again, if you give the cover crop more growing season, it will grow more. Imagine that. But so this is a nice answer to the second question, or I guess it was the third poll question that I asked you at the beginning, is that really what we find is that this number for accumulation in the spring or in the fall was 55 pounds. Here it's 31. So that suggests to us that a growing season unit in the fall is actually worth more than in the spring. So if you answered, at least from what our research that we found, that first option, that if it was planted earlier in fall and terminated earlier in spring, that you could actually grow more biomass. Again, that's what we found. It might be a little different from your experience, but I think that this is something interesting for us to consider as I just kind of summarize here in this table. Here's my promised results in bushels per acre and pounds per acre of cover crop biomass. So this is a summary of the April and May planting dates for the different varieties, their predicted harvest dates, yields, rye planting dates that we simulated, and the amount of biomass that you might get. So the idea with this is that this is a type of information that you might consider if you had a biomass goal, if you knew, for example, how much you felt you needed to improve infiltration, reduce erosion, or in the case of probably many of the people in the audience today, thinking about how much forage you're looking to produce, that you might be able to use this kind of information to think about trade-offs, that a few days of cover crop growth can lead to a big difference if you're willing to give that cover crop more growing season. But that really comes back to what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve. And what I find when I talk to farmers who are committed to cover crops, that sometimes a few bushels per acre difference is not make or break, right? If they can get more cover crop growth, that's what they're looking for. And so this kind of summary gives us just an opportunity to know what's possible, right? So as I already showed you, those predicted harvest dates range between these different comparative relative maturities in about a month. But you can see they obviously make a huge difference in yield. But if you're just talking about a medium season or a medium maturity length variety versus a longer maturity length variety, you can see that that can lead to, significantly more cover crop biomass if you're willing to allow for some of those yield trade-offs. But again, it comes back to what's your goal. If it's for forage or weed control, having more cover crop growing season might definitely be worth it. I just have a few more slides here just to summarize first the results that we found from the cover crop simulations project here that I've just presented. That we found that earlier planting, mid-September versus late October could make 10 times difference in the amount of biomass that you could get if you were thinking about terminating in the middle of April. And on the flip side of that, that there was 4 times more biomass produced when you terminated at the end of April versus the beginning. And then again, on the weather differences, the difference between a warm and wet or a cold and dry year was about 4 times the biomass, right? So hopefully that won't happen every year. It shouldn't from a probability standpoint, but obviously we know the weather makes a big difference. We did not see yield penalties associated with differences in planting corn in April and May, which is what we'd expect, but again, potential for more opportunity to extend the cover crop into the spring. And there are yield penalties associated with selecting a longer season cash crop, right? But if you're able to plant it earlier, harvest earlier, that gives you more time in the fall as well. And so I'll just wrap up with a few concluding thoughts here, in the title of my presentation. I really see the idea of treating cover crops like cash crops as a systems approach, that we really need to be thoughtful about all aspects of what you grow throughout the year. So I asked the question at the beginning, if you're thinking about your cash crop with more or less detail, I'm not going to say it was a trick question, but just to get you thinking that, there's a lot of important considerations that we might treat more optimally if we really want to get the most out of the cover crop. And of course, there's a number of approaches that can do this, but what farmers report is that they have the most success with establishing a cover crop if they're doing it with a drill post cash crop harvest. Of course, I know there's a number of other ways that people are innovating, but I think this is a way, especially it sounds like there's a lot of beginners or people who are new to cover crops, that there's still a lot of opportunity that can be achieved planting your cover crop after cash crop harvest. And I think the most important thing for me is thinking about your goals. What is your goal of a cover crop? You should always be starting, in my opinion, from that point, because that will help you make the decision about how do you manage some of these decisions with your growing season. And hopefully work like ours can help think about making those decisions. And I wanted to just show you a couple of quotes in terms of the systems approach idea from farmers that I worked with. When I was a graduate student at Iowa State in 2014, we had a focus group project. We talked to farmers who were using cover crops in Iowa, really innovative, doing some interesting things. It's been almost 6 years since then, but they said lots of things that were very resonant, right? So I won't read this to you exactly, but this is how farmers are thinking about the ones who are really making cover crops work, that they're not actually that simple, right? That it does require tweaking various aspects of management changes. And related to this, I really love this quote that was shared by a farmer. And in part, I like it because they're, critiquing constructively what we sometimes do in research, right? That if you treat everything exactly the same in your cash crop system, with and without the cover crop, then the cover crop is not going to win, right? The cover crop's going to lose every time. So I really did like the way these farmers articulated some of these ideas in terms of shifting different elements of management to make cover crops work. And finally, I thought I might just end on a philosophical note for all of us cover crop enthusiasts, grass pasture enthusiasts on the call. This is something that a colleague shared with me just last week, and it really resonated with me. So this was a speech that Henry Wallace, when he was the Secretary of Agriculture, gave. You can imagine just June of 1940 was another difficult time in our country, right? This was during a World War. It was on the heels of the Dust Bowl and Depression. And this was from a national radio address. And he was trying to highlight the connection and the need that we have for grass in our agricultural systems to humans. And I just thought this was really poignant for this time in our country when a lot of people are struggling, pandemic, and protests for more equality, right? I think it's helpful to remember that there are things like grass that might be transcendent that we all share in common, that there's always, I think, more that we have in common than not. So thank you for the opportunity to share my work, and I look forward to answering any questions and staying in touch if you are looking for more information.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. That was such a great presentation, so much great information. It's really incredible to learn how much more biomass you can get just with a few more days of letting it grow. So that's great. And so now we're kind of moving on to our question and answer section here. And if you haven't already, there is the questions pane in the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. And you should feel free to submit a question that you have for Andrea if you have anything that's been on your mind. We have a couple in here. Here's one for you, Andrea. What benefits were seen for increased cover crop biomass, which trades off with some yield?
Maybe you could repeat that one.
Yeah. So what benefits were seen for increased cover crop biomass? And then I think which trades off with some yield?
Okay, so I might, is it okay, Kelsey, if I go back a couple slides in this? Okay, so I'm going to go back to, see if I can go back to my summary table. I think that this is the question that someone is interested in, kind of seeing all of this together. At least this helps me think about it, right? So I would say, if you pair kind of this information, if you're thinking about, a medium season variety planted by April, our model predicts could be harvested by mid-September. So that would give you the potential for 2.5 tons on average of biomass. And again, is that worth to you having 10 or 15 more days of growth, and on average about 1,000 pounds? Again, the April scenario I think is a little nicer because it does show earlier harvest dates, earlier ability to plant the rye sooner. So I don't know that I have a quick snappy answer for this. I think that this table kind of helps summarize, what those trade-offs might be. But again, I think it comes back to the goal. If this is, the amount of biomass you want to achieve, then, how might you back that out in terms of planting date and variety selection? What I can say in relation to this, in the field study, and the field study was just done for 2 years, they actually saw a yield plateau at about 105-day variety in those 2 years. So they didn't actually see a big yield difference between 105 and 110 or 115 day, which I think is actually pretty interesting. The model is going to behave in a slightly more predictable way, but they saw pretty much the same yields between 105 and 115, and the difference in those 2 weeks could make a really big difference. It could almost yield 2 times more biomass. Because that's what they found in the field. So hopefully that answers the question that someone was was
Yeah.
thinking of.
So it really goes back to your goals.
I think so.
That makes sense.
There's no free lunch, right?
Right. Okay, here's another one. Since later fall planting can be hard to do with full season crops, should interseeding be given more research weight?
I think that's a great question. And one of the things that I meant to say but didn't yet is I fully realize that our model is hypothetical and that we're assuming a scenario that is not always possible in the field every year because of weather, equipment issues. I mean, I fully understand that. And so I completely agree. And I think that there is, at least in Nebraska, and you're welcome to follow up with me about this too. We're working with some producers who are doing interseeding the cover crops even at this time of year. So I think for establishment, it is a great way if you do not want to trade off, or you don't want to trade off maybe the end or be bothered with having to plant after plant your cover crop after corn harvest. So yes, I think so. I think more people are starting to think about that. I wish there could be oodles and oodles more cover crop research. There's lots of important questions. So yes.
Yeah. Here's one that was similar to the one from earlier. We hear a lot about diversifying cover crop mixes, with the general message being that the more diverse, the better. Are there biomass productivity benefits from higher mix diversity, negative trade-offs?
That is a very good question. In my experience in our environment, and again, I'm coming from the perspective of Iowa, Nebraska, where for the most part, there is not as much growing season. When you have mixes, the grasses, like winter rye, tend to dominate the mixes. So my perspective is that if your main goal, again, it comes back to goals. If your main goal is biomass, then cereal rye is a workhorse, right? I think that if your goal is to have some fertility from that cover crop, some nutrients, so you want legumes, or if you're looking for more brassicas, I think that there can absolutely be benefits, but I think that you really have to have a plan to plant as early as possible in late August, early September, which is probably unlikely in a corn soybean rotation. I think if you have a small grain crop in your rotation, then by all means grow a beautiful mix that could be planted in July or August, right? So in my experience, the issue with the mix is getting the other varieties or the other crop species to grow more than the grass or an equal amount. But that, of course, could be overcome with management. So I think you could still grow plenty of cover crop biomass for legume or brassica if you have optimal planting timing
Yeah, so it really depends
and
on where
good
you live.
establishment conditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here's one kind of a big one, and it's a two-part. So, um,
Okay.
what impact might climate change in the Midwest have on profitability, productivity of cover crops, and how might producers need to shift in planting dates and/or crop varieties?
That's a very good question. Um, okay, so climate change impact profitability, productivity,
Hmm.
cover crops,
Yep.
and
And then how might producers need to shift in planting dates and/or crop varieties?
yeah. So in general, at least in the Midwest, the predictions that we see are for slightly more, well, at least in Nebraska, it's for slightly more rainfall on average. Across the Midwest, I think there's maybe more in the eastern corn belt, slightly more rainfall than what we might expect here in Nebraska. But the overarching trend and that we're already experiencing, so there's what the climate models predict, and then there's what we're already experiencing, which is increasing rainfall variability, right? So we're having more heavy rain events in the spring. In fact, the seasonality in Nebraska for climate change is that we're getting less water, less rain in the summer and more in the fall, winter, and spring. So I think that actually presents a really important opportunity for cover crops, that when they're growing, there could be more moisture. And something that people talk about, but I feel like they don't talk about enough, is the fact that that cover crop could use that moisture in the spring when it's in excess.
Mhm.
So I think that cover crops could become even more important as that seasonality of water shifts. And actually, one of my, and I'd be happy whoever asked this question, they could follow up with me and I could share the paper. We did some modeling with the same platform that I just showed, thinking about some future climate scenarios with, that was made predictions for Iowa. And we actually saw that with a warmer atmosphere, it's probably not a surprise, we saw a slight increase in cover crop growth. If you were to, simulate into, we did through about mid-century in that project. So I think that cover crops could become even more important to use the additional water and heat that we might have. And then just in terms of that second question, shifting planting dates, I think this is what people are already experiencing.
Yeah.
We had generally pretty optimal conditions for planting this year, and then it's kind of, at least here, been like cooler and still wet. But um, I think that you have to be prepared for the unexpected, and that I don't know how the best seed in the world is going to do if you can't get in your field because it's too wet until
Mhm.
June. And I think being prepared for the unexpected, if that means planting later and a shorter season variety, I mean, the improvement in seed quality is pretty incredible over the last, several decades. So I think even planting into June can still, of course, that's not optimal, but if there's no
Right.
other option, then I think it is going to continue to be a challenge. And I think that we'll have to continue thinking about all solutions. But I do think that growing plants more of the year to use water is one that we need to really continue to consider.
Mhm. Yeah. So if you're just starting to use cover crops now, good, and keep using them because they're going to be
Yeah,
more and more important as encourage all your farmer friends. Well, farmers are very good at adapting. So,
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
and we have someone asking, what about flying on the cover crop over corn in August? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think that if you have timely rain, it can be great. I think that, again, if you have the, service provider or resources available to you, I think that can be a great option also. I mean, again, what we're simulating in this work that I'm presenting, I didn't want to say that it was the only option for extending the cover crop window. Just the basics of how we would manage crops, right? Having the seed directly into the ground is going to be better, but of course that's not possible. So I think that that kind of broadcast or overseeding is a great option. Of course, it is going to also depend on if you get rain after. So the weather is going to make an important, going to have important impacts there. And actually, I saw, and I know you've had some speakers in the series from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. They had some great speakers at their conference this past year, and even just getting to think about, what can be done planting with drones.
Oh,
Um, yeah, of course, there's like lots of trade-offs to think about with, the type of seed, the species, the seed, the weight of the seed, how fast it can go in planting, but there's all kinds of innovations that might be done. I think, again, to me, it really just comes back to your goals and your system. But it's another good way to extend the season for sure.
yeah. Here's another good one. So, does holding the cover crop longer into the spring pose unique challenges for termination compared to earlier?
It could. I think it would depend on the weather also. That again, and I want to, caveat by saying what we did here with the simulations was hypothetical. We're assuming that, you know, you would have the optimal conditions, and that almost never happens.
Right.
So, of course, if you're taking the risk of terminating later, I would say just, continue keeping an eye on the forecast and getting started, right? Like, I think if you are new, you don't need to be as risky. You can start on a few acres and, terminate well in advance. If you have a nice day in early April than do it, if you're worried about running into, weather concerns later. So of course it's a risk. Spring is so variable where we are. So yes, it could be a risk, but I think especially when you're learning, the best thing to do is to, just try the things that you would feel the most comfortable doing to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you measuring soil health in regards to cover crops versus no cover crop system?
So in this project that I'm referring to or that I presented today, it's not kind of directly related to soil health. I am involved in soil health related projects.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think what's the best way to answer this. I mean, there's a lot of things you could measure in your soil health, and I like to think about some of the kind of, if you've ever seen the Soil Health Institute has their tier 1 soil health indicators. Um, and some of those are more related to soil texture, kind of inherent soil properties. I like to think, if somebody just ran up to me and said, what would you measure if you wanted to think about soil health? I mean, to me, the important things that the soil would be most sensitive to management, especially with a cover crop, are some of the more dynamic soil properties. So things like aggregate stability is a really good indicator of erosivity of the soil. And those consistent roots in the soil can have an impact on that. So I think aggregate stability, it's like a pretty easy test to do. I think that is a good one. I think infiltration is one that I happen to get really excited about because it has a direct relationship to the amount of water that we're getting. It's a really easy test that you could do in the field yourself. Those are a few. I mean, people are really excited now about soil biology. Lots of the commercial labs have opportunities to look at enzyme activity, microbial biomass. The Haney test is becoming more and more popular. It's got a lot of different indicators of soil biological and chemical properties. So, and those can be more or less sensitive to management. So things that could actually change from the presence of the cover crop. So tier 1 indicators, dynamic properties are some that again are more sensitive than others, and maybe that are more or less important to you on your farm or to a producer on their farm.
Yeah, we definitely at Pasture Project do the Haney tests for our research farms, and it's a great indicator
Yeah.
on our grazing cover crop project. So definitely recommend farmers doing that. Um, well, I think we are almost at time here at 3:58. So I'm going to go ahead and um, wrap us up. And thank you, Andrea. I'm trying to advance the slides here
Thank
to
you
get
for
to.
all those great
Yeah,
questions.
those were great questions. Thank you, everyone. Just a couple reminders here. Um, we have other webinars, and if you have suggestions for webinars or speakers you would like to see, please feel free to um, um, reach out to us directly. And then also, if you please complete the post-webinar survey, it really helps us as we develop future webinars and get your feedback. It's really important to us. And then also feel free to like I said, reach out to us directly. There's Andrew's details and mine as well. And we thank everybody for coming and participating today. And again, thank you, Andrea. And this webinar was recorded and it will be posted within a week to the Passion Project website. And you can also find it on YouTube. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Andrea. And have
Thank you.
everybody have a great rest of your day.